The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, a study of the nature and origins of Christianity within the fertility cults of the ancient Near East by John M. Allegro. Amanita Muscaria. Doubleday and Company, Inc., Garden City, New York. Piracy notice. In order to keep this information available to the public, this book has been pirated. In memoriam to John Marco Allegro by Adam J. Cadmon. John M. Allegro was born February 17, 1923 in London. He served in the Royal Navy, then studied at the University of Manchester, where he obtained a first-class honors degree in Oriental Studies in 1951. A year later, he was awarded a master's degree for his work on the Balaam oracles. His Oxford research on Hebrew dialects was interpreted when, in 1953, he was called to join the first international team of scholars working on the newly discovered Dead Sea Scrolls in Jerusalem. Mr. Allegro was a lecturer, etymologist, and author credited with The Dead Sea Scrolls, 1956, The People of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1958, The Treasure of the Copper Scroll, 1960, The Shapira Affair, 1965, Search in the Desert, 1967, Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan, Qumran Cave 4, 1968, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, 1970, The End of a Road, 1970, The Chosen People, 1971, Lost Gods, 1977, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth, 1979, All Manner of Men, 1982, Physician, Heal Thyself, 1985. John Marco Allegro died suddenly of an aortic aneurysm on his 65th birthday, February 17, 1988, at his home in Sandbach, Cheshire. Before his death, Allegro had been criticized by his former friends and colleagues for his outspoken and unconventional ideas. But far from being banished as a scholar after years of academic attack, he resigned from the university out of his own accord. He did this before The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross went to print. He had enough of academia and wanted to write freelance. I believe we lost a modern day hero in linguistics, etymology, philology, theology, mycology, and much more when we lost John Marco Allegro. Original characters of Sumerian, cuneiform, and other hieroglyphic characters were lost by the character recognition software used in the piracy of this book. Please seek an original copy of The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross to reference missing letters and other possible errors made by the recognition software. 150 pages of reference notes at the back of this book have been omitted. Footnote numbers have for the most part been left intact. Some zeros and ones were not recognized. Primary errors made by Allegro are highlighted in red. Allegro did not understand the growth cycle, effects, and bitterness of Amanita muscaria. Allegro overlooked some references to both A. pantherina and P. cubensis, and wrongfully classified rue as an abrotafficient, not recognizing acacia and rue as ayahuasca analog. Allegro was wrongfully assumed that the mushrooms, and not religion and government themselves, were the cause of the shaman to protest against their suppression by the churches and governments. With that said, Allegro was a pioneer in the field of ethnomycology and founded many of the ideas many researchers use today, though most deny it. Enjoy your read. Author's note. This book is the first published statement of the fruits of some years' work of a largely philological nature. It presents a new appreciation of the relationship of the languages of the ancient world and the implication of this advance for our understanding of the Bible and of the origins of Christianity. It will be appreciated that such a statement has to be furnished with the technical data, even though much of it must be outside the scope of the general reader, for whom the book is primarily intended. In order to leave the text as unencumbered as possible, these notes have been gathered in a body at the end of the book, and the numbered references within the text may be safely ignored by the non-specialist. Acknowledgments. Quotations from the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, copyrighted 1952 and 1956, are used by permission. Quotations from the Homeric hymns, Pliny's Natural History, and Josephus's Jewish Wars and Antiquities are used by permission of the Loeb Classical Library. The frontispiece photograph is used by permission of Rex Loden. The photograph facing page 74 is used by permission of Photograph Thulier. Contents. Introduction. 1. In the beginning, God created. Chapter 2. Summer and the beginnings of history. Chapter 3. The names of the gods. Chapter 4. Plants and drugs. Chapter 5. Plant names and the mysteries of the fungus. Chapter 6. The key of the kingdom. Chapter 7. The man-child born of a virgin. Chapter 8. Woman's part in the creative process. Chapter 9. The sacred prostitute. Chapter 10. Religious lamentation. Chapter 11. The mushroom, egg, and birds of mythology. Chapter 12. The heavenly twins. Chapter 13. Star of the morning. Chapter 14. Color and consistency. Chapter 15. Mushroom cosmography. Chapter 16. David, Egypt, and the census. Chapter 17. Death and resurrection. Chapter 18. The garden of Adonis, Eden and delight, zealots and Muslim. Chapter 19. The Bible as a book of morals. Notes. 207. Indices, page 308. Figures. The Near East. Summer and Akkad. 3. Section through the calyx and fruit henbane. 4. Diagrammic section of eye volva before birth, a mature mushroom. 5. Zion and the valleys of Kurdran and Hinnom. 6. Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. Introduction. No one religion in the ancient Near East can be studied in isolation. All stem from man's questioning about the origin of life and how to ensure his own survival. He has always been acutely conscious of his insufficiency. However, much he progressed technically, making clothes, shelter, conserving food and water supplies, and so on. The forces of nature were always greater than he. The winds would blow away his shelter, the sun parch his crops. Wild beasts prey on his animals. He was always on the defensive in a losing battle. And out of this sense of dependency and frustration, religion was born. And somehow man had to establish communications with the source of the world's fertility, and thereafter maintain a right relationship with it. And over the course of time, he built up a body of experiential knowledge of rituals that he or his representatives could perform, or words to recite, which were reckoned to have the greatest influence on this fertility deity. At first, they were largely imitative. If rain in the desert lands was the source of life, then the moisture from heaven must be only a more abundant kind of spermatozoa. If the male organ ejaculated this precious fluid and made life in the woman, then above the skies the source of nature's semen must be a mighty penis, as the earth which bore its offspring was the womb. It followed, therefore, that to induce the heavenly phallus to complete its orgasm, man must stimulate it by sexual means, by singing, dancing, orgastic displays, and, above all, by the performance of the copulatory act itself. However, and man progressed in his control of the world about him, there remained a large gap between what he wanted at any one time and what he could achieve on his own account. There was always some unscalable mountain, some branch of knowledge which remained unpenetrable, some disease with no known cure. It seemed to him that if he had managed painstakingly to grope his way to a knowledge and dexterity so far above the animals, then in some mysterious way his thinkers and artisans must have been tapping a source of wisdom no less real than the rain that fructified the ground. The heavenly penis, then, was not only the source of life-giving semen, it was the origin of knowledge. The seed of God was the Word of God. The dream of man is to become God. Then he would be omnipotent, no longer fearful of the snows in winter or the sun in summer, or the drought that killed his cattle and made his children's bellies swell grotesquely. The penis in the skies would rise and spurt its vital juice when man commanded, and the earth below would open its vulva and gestate its young as man required. And above all, man would learn the secrets of the universe not piecemeal, painfully, by trial and fatal error, but by a sudden, wonderful illumination from within. But God is jealous of his power and his knowledge. He brooks no rivals in heavenly places. If, in his mercy, he will allow just a very few of his chosen mortals to share his divinity, it is but for a fleeting moment. Under very special circumstances, he will permit men to rise to the throne of heaven and glimpse the beauty and the glory of omniscience and omnipotence. For those who are so privileged, there has seemed no greater or more worthwhile experience. The colors are brighter, the sounds more penetrating, every sensation is magnified, every natural force exaggerated. For such a glimpse of heaven, men have died. In the pursuit of this goal, great religions have been born, shown as a beacon to men struggling still in their unequal battle with nature, and then to have died, stifled by their own attempts to perpetuate, codify, and evangelize the mystic vision. Our present concern is to show that Judaism and Christianity are such cultic expressions of this endless pursuit by man to discover instant power and knowledge. Granted, the first proposition that the vital forces of nature are controlled by an extraterrestrial intelligence. These religions are logical developments from the older, cruder fertility cults. With the advance of technical proficiency, the aims of religious ritual became less to influence the weather and the crops than to attain wisdom and the knowledge of the future. The word that seeped through the labia of the earth's womb became to the mystic of less importance than the logos which he believed. His religion enabled him to apprehend and enthuse him with divine omniscience. But the source was the same vital power of the universe, and the cultic practice differed little. And to raise the crops, the farmer copulated with his wife in the fields, and to seek the drug that would send his soul winging to the seventh heaven and back, the initiates into the religious mysteries had their priestesses seduce the god and draw him into their grasp as a woman fascinates her partner's penis to erection. For the way to God and the fleeting view of heaven was through plants more plentifully endued with the sperm of God than any other. These were the drug herbs, the science of whose cultivation and use has been accumulated over centuries of observation and dangerous experiment. Those who had this secret wisdom of the plants were the chosen of their God. To them alone he had vouchsafed the privilege of access to the heavenly throne. And if he was jealous of his power, no less were those who served him in the cultic mysteries. There was no gospel to be shouted from the rooftops. Paradise was for none but the favored few. The incantations and rites by which they conjured forth their drug plants, and the details of the bodily and mental preparations undergone before they could ingest their god, were the secrets of the cult to which none but the initiate, bound by fearful oaths, had access. Very rarely, and then only for urgent practical purposes, were those secrets ever committed to writing. Normally, they would be passed from the priest to the initiate by word of mouth, dependent for their accurate transmission on the trained memories of men dedicated to the learning and recitation of their scriptures. But if for some drastic reason, like the disruption of their cultic centers by war or persecution, it became necessary to write down the precious names of the herbs and the manner of their use and accompanying incantations, it would be in some esoteric form comprehensible only to those within their dispersed communities. Such an occasion, we believe, was the Jewish revolt of A166, instigated probably by members of the cult, swayed by their drug-induced madness to believe God had called them to master the world in his name. They provoked the mighty power of Rome to swift and terrible action. Jerusalem was ravaged, her temple destroyed. Judaism was disrupted, and her people driven to seek refuge with communities already established around the Mediterranean coastlands. The mystery cults found themselves without their central fount of authority, with many of their priests killed in the aberrative rebellion or driven into the desert. The secrets, if they were not be lost forever, had to be committed to writing, and yet, if found, the documents must give nothing away or betray those who still dared to defy the Roman authorities and continue their religious practices. The means of conveying the information were at hand, and had been for thousands of years. The folk tales of the ancients had, from the earliest times, contained myths based upon the personification of plants and trees. They were invested with human faculties and qualities, and their names and physical characteristics were applied to the heroes and heroines of the stories. Some of these were just tales spun for entertainment. Others were political parables like Jotham's fable about the trees in the Old Testament, while others were means of remembering and transmitting therapeutic folklore. The names of the plants were spun out to make the basis of the stories, whereby the creatures of fantasy were identified, dressed, and made to enact their parts. Here, then, was the literary device to spread occult knowledge to the faithful, to tell the story of a rabbi called Jesus, and invest him with the power and names of the magic drug, to have him live before the terrible events that had disrupted their lives, to preach a love between men, extending even to the hated Romans. Thus, reading such a tale, should it fall into Roman hands, even their mortal enemies might be deceived and not probe farther into the activities of the cells of the mystery cults within their territories. The ruse failed. Christians, hated and despised, were hauled forth and slain in their thousands. The cult well nigh perished. What eventually took its place was a travesty of the real thing, a mockery of the power that could raise men to heaven and give them the glimpse of God for which they gladly died. The story of the rabbi crucified at the instigation of the Jews became a historical peg upon which the new cult's authority was founded. What began as a hoax became a trap even to those who believed themselves to be the spiritual heirs of the mystery religion and took to themselves the name of Christian. Above all, they forgot or purged from the cult and their memories the one supreme secret on which their whole religious and ecstatic experience depended on: the names and identity of the source of the drug, the key to heaven, the sacred mushroom. The fungus recognized today as the Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, had been known from the beginning of history. Beneath the skin of its characteristic red and white spotted cap, there is concealed a powerful hallucinatory poison. Its religious use among certain Siberian peoples and others has been the subject of study in recent years, and its exhilarating and depressive effects have been clinically examined. These include the stimulation of the perceptive faculties, so that the subject sees objects much greater or much smaller than they really are. Colors and sounds are much enhanced, and there is a general sense of power, both physical and mental, quite outside the normal range of human experience. The mushroom has always been a thing of mystery. The ancients were puzzled by its manner of growth without seed, the speed with which it made its appearance after rain, and its as rapid disappearance. Born from a vulva or egg, it appears like a small penis, raising itself like the human organ sexually aroused, and when it spread wide its canopy, the old botanists saw it as a phallus bearing the burden of a woman's groin. Every aspect of the mushroom's existence was fraught with sexual illusions, and in its phallic form the ancients saw a replica of the fertility god himself. It was the Son of God. Its drug was a purer form of the god's own spermatoza than that discoverable in any other form of living matter. It was, in fact, God himself manifest on earth. And to the mystic it was the divinely given means of entering heaven. And God had come down in the flesh to show the way to himself. By himself, to pluck such a precious herb was attended at every point with peril. The time before sunrise, the words to be uttered, the name of the guardian angel, were vital to the operation, but more was needed. Some form of substitution was necessary to make an atonement to the earth robbed of her offspring. Yet such was the divine nature of the holy plant, as it was called. Only the God could make the necessary sacrifice to redeem the Son. The Father had to supply even the price of redemption. These are all phrases used of the sacred mushroom, as they are of the Jesus of Christian theology. Our present study has much to do with names and titles, and only when we can discover the nomenclature of the sacred fungus within and without the cult can we begin to understand its function and theology. The main factor that has made these new discoveries possible has been the realization that many of the most secret names of the mushroom go back to ancient Sumerian, the oldest written language known to us, witnessed by cuneiform texts dating from the 4th millennium BC. Furthermore, It now appears that this ancient tongue provides a bridge between the Indo-European languages, which include Greek, Latin, and our own tongue, and the Semitic group, which includes the languages of the Old Testament, Hebrew, and Aramaic. And for the first time, it becomes possible to decipher the names of God's mythological characters, classical and biblical, and plant names. Thus, their place in the cubic system and their functions in the old fertility religions can be determined. The great barriers that have hitherto seemed to divide the ancient world, classical and biblical, have at last been crossed, and at a more significant level than has previously been possible by merely comparing their respective mythologies. Stories and characters, which seem quite different in the way they are presented in various locations and at widely separated points in history, can now be shown often to have the same central theme. Even gods, as different as Zeus and Yahweh, embody the same fundamental conception of the fertility deity, for their names and origin are precisely the same. A common tongue overrides physical and racial boundaries. Even languages, so apparently different as Greek and Hebrew, when they can be shown to derive from a common fount, point to a communality of culture at some early stage. Comparisons can therefore be made on a scientific, philological level, which might have appeared unthinkable before now. Suddenly, almost overnight, the ancient world has shrunk. All roads in the Near East lead back to the Mesopotamian basin, to ancient Sumer. Similarly, the most important of the religions and mythologies of that area are probably far beyond, are reaching back to the mushroom cult of Sumer and her successors. In biblical studies, the old divisions between Old and New Testament areas of research, never very meaningfully except to the Christian theologian, become even less valid. As far as the origins of Christianity are concerned, we must look not just to interstatemental literature, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, and the newly discovered writings from the Dead Sea, nor even merely the Old Testament and other Semitic works. But we have to bring into consideration Sumerian religious and mythological texts and the classical writings of Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. The Christian Easter is as firmly linked to the Bacchic Antheria as the Jewish Passover. Above all, it is the theologian who must be the spearhead of the new inquiry. It is primarily a study in words. A written word is more than a symbol. It is an expression of an idea. To penetrate to its inner meanings is to look into the mind of a man who wrote it. Later generations may give different meanings to that symbol, extending its range of reference far beyond the original intention. But if we can trace the original significance, then it should be possible to follow the trial by which it developed. In doing so, it is sometimes possible even to outline the progress of man's mental, technical, or religious development. The earliest writing was by means of pictures, crudely incised diagrams on stone and clay. However, lacking such symbols may be in grammatical or syntaxical refinement. They do convey in an instant, the one feature which seemed to the ancient scribe the most significant aspect of the object or action he is trying to represent. Love he shows as a flaming torch in a womb, a foreign country as a hill, because he lived on a plain, and so on. And as the art of writing developed further, we can begin to recognize the first statements of ideas which came later to have tremendous philosophical importance. Life, God, priest, temple, grace, sin, and so on. To seek their later meanings in religious literature, like the Bible, we must first discover their basic meaning and follow their development through as far as extant writings will allow. For example, as we may now understand, sin for Jew and Christian had to do with the emission to waste of human sperm, a blasphemy against the God who was identified with the precious liquid. If to discover this understanding of sin seems today of only limited academic interest, it is worth recalling that it is this same principle that lies at the root of modern Catholic strictures against the use of the pill. As far as the main burden of our present inquiry is concerned, our newfound ability to penetrate to the beginnings of language means that we can set the later mystery cults as those of Judaism, of the Dionysiac religion and Christianity, into their much wider context, to discover the first principles from which they developed, probe the mysteries of their cultic names and invocations, and, in the case of Christianity at least, appreciate something of the opposition they encountered among governing authorities and the measures taken to transmit their secrets under cover of ancient mythologies in modern dress. Our study then begins at the beginning, with an appreciation of religion in terms of a stimulation of the God to procreation and the provision of life. Armed with our new understanding of the language relationships of the Near East, we can tackle the major problems involved in botanical nomenclature and discover those features of the more God-endued plants which attracted the attention of the old medicine men and prophets. The isolation of the names and epithets of the sacred mushroom opens the door into the secret chambers of the mystery cults, which depended for their mystic hallucinatory experiences on the drugs found in the fungus. At long last, identification of the main characters of many of the old classical and biblical mythologies is possible. Since we can now decipher their names, above all, those mushroom epithets and holy invocations that the Christian cryptographers wove into their stories of the man Jesus and his companions can now be recognized, and the main features of the Christian cult laid bare. The isolation of the mushroom cult and the real, hidden meaning of the New Testament writings drives a wedge between the moral teachings of the Gospels and their quite amoral religious setting. The new discoveries must thus raise more acutely the question of the validity of Christian ethics for the present time. If the Jewish rabbi to whom they have hitherto been attributed turns out to have been no more substantial than the mushroom, the authority of his homilies must stand or fall on the assent they can command on their own merit. What follows in this book is, as has been said, primarily a study in words. To a reader brought up to believe in the essential historicity of the Bible narratives, some of the attitudes displayed in our approach to the texts may seem at first strange. We appear to be more interested with the words than with the events they seem to record, more concerned, say, in the meaning of Moses' name than his supposed role as Israel's first great political leader. Similarly, a century or so ago, it must have seemed strange to the average Bible student to understand the approach of a modernist of the day who was more interested in the ideas underlying the creation story of Genesis and their sources than to date, locate and identify the real Garden of Eden and to solve the problem of whence came Cain's wife. Then it took a revolution in man's appreciation of his development from lower forms of life and a clearer understanding of the age of this planet to force the theologian to abandon the historicity of Genesis. Now we face a new revolution in thought, which must make us reconsider the validity of the New Testament story. The breakthrough here is not in the field of history, but in philology. Our fresh doubts about the historicity of Jesus and his friends stem not from new discoveries about the land and people of Palestine of the first century, but about the nature and origin of the languages they spoke and the origins of their religious cults. What the student of Christian origins is primarily concerned with is what manner of writing is this book we call the New Testament? And in particular, just what are the narratives called the Gospels trying to convey? Is it history? This is certainly a possibility, but only one of many. And the fact that for nearly 2,000 years one religious body has pinned its faith upon not only the existence of the man Jesus, but even upon his spiritual nature and the historicity of certain unnatural events called miracles, is not really relevant to the inquiry. 100 years ago, this same body of opinion was equally adamant that the whole of human race could trace its origin to two people living in the middle of Mesopotamia, and that the earth had come into existence in the year 4004 BC. The inquirer has to begin with his only real source of knowledge, the written word. As far as Judaism and Christianity are concerned, this means the Bible. There is precious little else that can give us details about what the Israelite believed about his God and the world around him, or about the real nature of Christianity. The sparse references to one Christus or Christus in the works of contemporary non-Christian historians tell us nothing about the nature of the man, and only very dubiously, despite the claims often made for them, do they support his historicity. They simply bear witness to the fact, never in dispute, that the stories of the Gospels were in circulation soon after AD 70. If we want to know more about early Christianity, we must look to our only real source, the written words of the New Testament, and thus, as we have said, the inquiry is primarily philological. The New Testament is full of problems. They confront the critical inquirer on every side: chronological, topographical, historical, religious, and philological. It is not until the language problems have been resolved that the rest can be realistically appraised. And when in the last century a mass papyrological material became available from the ancient world and cast new light upon the nature of the Greek used in the New Testament, scholars felt that most of the major obstacles to a complete understanding of the texts would be removed. But in fact, to the Philologian, the thorny questions remain firmly embedded in the stories, and they have nothing to do with Aramaic transliterations in the text, coupled often with a translation which does not seem to offer a rendering of the original, like the nickname Boangers, supposed to mean sons of thunder, or the name Barnabas, said to represent son of consolation. Try as they will, the commentators cannot see how the translations fit the names. The general reader, and particularly to the Christian seeking moral or spiritual enlightenment from the New Testament, such trivia have meant little. To many scholars, too, details like these are of less importance than theological import of Jesus' teachings. It has been assumed that somewhere along the line of transmission some textual corruption occurred in the names, or that the translations were added by later hands, unfamiliar with the original language used by the Master and his companions. As we can now appreciate, these aberrations of the proper names and their pseudo-translations are of crucial importance. They provide us with a clue to the nature of original Christianity. Concealed within are secret names for the sacred fungus, the sex Christ, The deliberately deceptive nature of their mistranslations put the lie to the whole of the cover story of the man Jesus and his activities. Once the ruse is penetrated, then research can go ahead fast with fitting the Christian phenomenon more firmly into the cultic patterns of the ancient Near East. Many, apparently quite unrelated, facts about the ubiquitous mystery cults of the area and their related mythologies suddenly begin to come together into an intellectually satisfying whole. In any study of the sources and development of a particular religion, ideas are the vital factor. History takes second place. Even time is relatively unimportant. This is not to underestimate the importance of political and sociological influences in the fashioning of a cult and its ideology. But the prime materials of the philosophy stem from a fundamental conception of the universe and the source of life. Certain highly imaginative or inspired men may appear from time to time in people's history and affect their beliefs and manner of life of their contemporaries and successors. They adapt or develop what they find and give it a new impetus or direction. But the clay they are freshly modeling was there already and forms the main object of inquiry for the student of the cult's development. We are, throughout this book, mainly interested in this clay, and the very strange shapes it assumed in the mystery religions, of which we may now recognize Christianity as an important example. Of course, history now and again forces itself on our attention. Did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ever exist as real people? Was there ever a sojourn in Egypt of the chosen people, or a political leader called Moses? Was the theologically powerful conception of the Exodus ever historical fact? These and many other such questions are raised afresh by our studies, but it is our contention that they are not of prime importance. Far more urgent is the main import of the myths in which these names are found. If we're right in finding the real relevance in the age-old cult of the sacred mushroom, then the nature of the oldest Israelite religion has to be reassessed, and it matters comparatively little whether these characters are historical or not. In the case of Christianity, the historical questions are perhaps more acute. If the New Testament story is not what it seems, then when and how did the Christian church come to take it at its face value and make the worship of a single man, Jesus, crucified and miraculously brought back to life, the central theme of its religious philosophy? The question is bound up with the nature of heresies that the church drove out into the desert. Unfortunately, we just have not sufficient material to enable us to identify all these sects and know their secrets. The church destroyed everything it considered heretical, and what we know of such movements derives largely from the refutations of the early fathers of their beliefs. But at least we no longer have to squeeze such aberrations into a century or two after AD 30. Christianity, under its various names, had been thriving for centuries before that. As we may now appreciate, it was the more original cult that was driven underground by the combined efforts of the Roman, Jewish, and ecclesiastical authorities. It was the supreme heresy which came on, made terms with the secular powers, and became the church of today. We are, then, dealing with ideas rather than people. We cannot name the chief characters of our story. Doubtless there were real leaders exercising considerable power over their fellows, but in the mystery cults they were never named to the outsider. We cannot, like the Christian pietists, conjure for ourselves a picture of a young man working at his father's carpentry bench, taking little children in his arms, or talking earnestly with a Mary while her sister did the housework. In this respect, our study is not an easy one. There is no one simple answer to the problems of the New Testament, discoverable by anyone just reshuffling the gospel narratives to produce yet another picture of the man Jesus. Ours is a study of words, and through them of ideas. And at the end, we have to test the validity of our conclusions, not against comparative history, least of all against the beliefs of the church, past or present, but against the overall pattern of religious thought as it can now be traced through the ancient Near East from the earliest times. The question we have to ask is, does the Christianity as now revealed for the first time fit adequately into what went before the first century, not what came after in its name? Chapter 1. In the beginning, God created. Religion is part of growing up. The reasoning that taught man that he was cleverer than the animals made him also aware of his own deficiencies. He could catch and kill beasts stronger and fleeter than himself because he could plan ahead, seek out their paths, and construct booby traps. Later, that same foresight led him to the art of farming and conserving his food supplies against the seasonal dearths. In the lands of marginal rainfall, he learnt eventually the technique of digging and lining cisterns, and civilization began. Nevertheless, the vast areas of natural resources were outside man's control. If the animals did not breed, there was no hunting. If the rain did not fall, the furrowed earth remained barren. Clearly, there was a power in the universe that was greater than man, a seemingly arbitrary control of nature, which could make a mockery of man's hunting and farming skills. His very existence depended upon maintaining a right relationship with that power. That is, on religion. Interesting as it is to speculate on the precise forms prehistoric religious thought and ritual may have taken, we have in fact very little direct evidence. The cave drawings found in France, Spain, and Italy tell us little more than that man, some 10 to 20,000 years ago, was a hunter, and that he may have enacted some kind of sympathetic ritual of slaughter to aid him in the hunt. This practical use of the graphic arts is paralleled today by Australian Aborigines who accompany their symbolic portrait with a ritual mime, dancing, and recitation of traditional epics. Doubtless primitive man of Paleolithic periods did much the same, but the oral part of his rituals, which alone could adequately explain the drawings, is lost forever. The relics of his plastic arts, relief carving, and clay modeling emphasize his interest in fecundity. The Gravettian culture, extending widely over South Russia and Central Europe, and spreading to Italy, France, and Spain, abounds in examples of the so-called mother goddess figurines. These clay models of women with pendulous breasts, huge buttocks, and distended befies have obvious sexual and reproductive allusions, as do their male counterparts. I, One, doubtless, all these had magical or religious purposes. But it is not until man has learnt the art of writing that he can communicate with a comparatively later age. Only then can we, with any real assurance, begin to read his mind and thoughts about God. Unfortunately, this only happened comparatively late in his development in terms of evolutionary time, barely a minute or two ago. By then, he was by no means primitive, and the first known attempts at connected writings were crude affairs, registering no more than lists of objects and numbers. But their very existence points to an advanced stage of economic administration, which is amply supported by archaeology. The wonder is that man had been able to progress so far without writing, and the one facility we should have thought essential for social progress. How, we are inclined to ask in our jotting pad age, was it possible to administer a region, farm out temple lands, collect revenues, fight wars, and maintain communications over long distances without easy means of documentation? We are apt to forget that in those days they still had memories. The kind of superhuman results promised the modern subscriber to correspondence courses in memory training must have been commonplace among intelligent people 6,000 years ago. Even today, it is not uncommon to find a Muslim who can recite the whole of the Quran, or a Jew who knows long sections of the Bible and Talmud by heart. The first books, then, were the brain's memory cells. The first pen was the tongue. It was the ability of Homo sapiens to communicate with his fellows, to organize community life, and transmit hard-earned skills from father to son that raised man far above the animals. It was this same means of communication that brought him in touch with his God, to flatter, cajole, and even threaten to obtain the means of life. Experience showed that, as in his human relationships, some words and actions were more effective than others, and there arose a body of uniform ritual and liturgy whose memorizing and enactment was the responsibility of the holy men of the community. When around 2500 BC, the first great religious poems and epics of the Near East came to be written down, they had behind them already a long history of oral transmission. The fundamental religious conceptions they express go back thousands of years. Yet there were still another 1500 years to go before the earliest text of the Old Testament was composed. It is not, therefore, sufficient to look for the origins of Christianity only within the previous 1,000 years of Old Testament writings, nor to start the history of Judaism with a supposed dating of the patriarchs around 1750 BC. The origins of both cults go back into Near Eastern prehistory. The problem is how to relate specific details of these comparatively late religions with the earliest ideas about God. Our way into the mind of ancient man can only be through his writings, and this is the province of philology, the science of words. We have to seek in the symbols by which he represented his spoken utterances clues to his thinking. The limitations of such study are obvious. The first is the insufficiency of the early writing to express abstract ideas. Even when the philologist has collected all the texts available, compiled his grammars and dictionaries, and is confident of his decipherment, there still remains the inadequacy of any written word, even of the most advanced languages, to express thought. Even direct speech can fail to convey our meaning, and has to be accompanied with gesture and facial expression. A sign imprinted on wet clay, or even the flourish of the pen on paper, can leave much uncommunicated to the reader, as every poet and lover knows. Nevertheless, the written word is a symbol of thought, and behind it lies an attitude of mind, an emotion, a reasoned hypothesis, to which the reader can to some extent penetrate. It is with words and their meanings that this book is largely concerned, and the study of the relationship between words and the thoughts they express is called etymology, since it seeks the true Greek etymos meaning of the word. The etymologist looks for the root of the word, that is, the inner core which expresses its fundamental or radical concept. For example, if we were to seek the root of a modern barbarism like de-escalate, we should immediately remove the D and the verbal appendage ate, slice off the initial E as a recognizable prefix, and be left with "skal" for further study. The Latin scala means ladder, and we are clearly on the right track. But at this stage, the etymologist will look out for possible vocalic changes occurring between dialects. One of the more common is between one and in, and we are not surprised to find that an early form of the root has in place of I. So that Sanskrit, one of the earliest dialects of Indo-European, has a root skan, with the idea of going up. Sibilants can interchange also, such as S and Z, and short vowels can drop out in speech between consonants, like I between S and C. In fact, we can break down our Indo-European root skan, ascend, still further into two Sumerian symbols, zig, rise, and on, up. 1a. Or again, we should wish to track down the root of our word rule, meaning control, guide, exercise, influence over, etc. We should find that our etymological dictionaries will refer us through an adaptation of Old French back to the Latin regulo, direct, connected with regno, reign, rex, king, and so on. The root here is plain, reg, or the like, and its ultimate source we can now discover by taking our search back another 3 or 4 thousand years to the earliest known writing of all, that of ancient Sumer in the Mesopotamian basin. There we find a root, rig, to meaning shepherd, and by breaking the word down even further, we can discover the idea behind shepherd, that of ensuring the fecundity of the flocks in his charge. This explains the very common concept that the king was a shepherd to his people, since his task was primarily that of looking after the well-being and enrichment of the land and its people. Here, etymology has done more than discover the root meaning of a particular word. It has opened a window on prehistoric philosophic thought. The idea of the shepherd king's role in the community did not begin with the invention of writing. The written word merely expresses a long-held conception. If, then, in our search for the origins of religious cults and mythologies, we can trace their ideas back to the earliest known written texts, we can use etymological methods to probe even further into the minds that gave them literary form. Having arrived back at the primitive meaning of a root, the philologist has then to work his way forward again, tracing the way in which writers at different times use that root to express related concepts. For, of course, the meanings of words change. The more often they are used, the wider becomes their reference. Today, with faster and easier means of communication, it is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain control over the meanings of words. And this at a time when the need for understanding each other is most crucial. In antiquity, people and ideas did not move quite so fast. Travel was not so easy. Remote areas would stay remote over generations, and their languages would preserve old words and linguistic forms long lost in places more open to foreign influence. Religious terminology, which is the special interest of this work, is least susceptible to change. Even though day-to-day words must develop their meanings to accord with social conditions and the invention of new crafts, communication with the god required a precise, unchanging liturgy whose accurate transmission was the first responsibility of the priesthood. In the study of ancient literatures, the scholar has to bear in mind that the language of the hymns and epics may well differ considerably from the common tongue of the same period. One of the problems facing the student of Old Testament Hebrew is the probability that the classical tongue of the Bible does not accurately represent the spoken language of the ancient Israelites. Certainly, the vocabulary of the Bible is far too limited in extent to tell us much about the workday world of ancient Canaan. And when it comes to analyzing the linguistic and phonetic structure of biblical Hebrew in terms of actual speech, the conviction grows that we have is not the spoken dialect of any one community living in a single place at one time, but a kind of mixed artificial language composed perhaps of a number of dialects and used specifically for religious purposes. The importance of a liturgical language from our immediate point of view is that it will have been essentially conservative. It is such writing that we can expect to find words used in their most primitive sense. If religious terminology in general tends to resist change, this is often more the case with proper names, particularly those of the gods and epic heroes. It now appears that in many cases these have survived unfaltered over centuries, even millennia, of oral as well as written transmission. In this one category of words lies the greatest scope for present and future researches into the nature and meaning of the old mythologies. To be able to decipher the name of the god will tell us his prime function and thus the meaning of the prayers and rituals by which he was worshipped. The difficulty in this study has always been that the names are often very much older than the literature in which they occur, and are indecipherable in that language. So often, the commentator on some Greek myth, for example, has to confess that the hero's name is pre-Hellenic, of uncertain origin and meaning. All that he can do in such cases is to gather all the references he can find to that character and see if there is some common denominator in the stories or epithets which will give a clue on the meaning of his name. Anyone who has tried this procedure on his own account or studied in detail the efforts of others will know too well that the results are often at best tenuous and the exercise, to say the least, frustrating. One problem is that the same god or hero is differently described in different places. Zeus merits distinctive epithets and worship in Athens and in Crete, for example. What you expect of your god depends on your physical and spiritual needs in the immediate situation, and the stories you make up about him will reflect the social and ethnic conditions of your own time and place. Clearly, the mythologist can best estimate these local and temporal factors in his material if he knows the god's original place in the order of nature, that is, if he knows the source and meaning of his name. The dramatic step forward that is now possible in our researches into the origin of Near Eastern cults and mythologies arises from our ability to make these decipherments. We can now break down god names like Zeus and Yahweh, Jehovah, and hero names like Dionysus and Jesus, because it is possible to penetrate the linguistic barriers imposed by the different languages in which their respective literatures have reached us. We can reach back beyond the Greek of the Classic and the New Testament and the Hebrew of the Old Testament to a linguistic source common to all. Furthermore, as might be expected in such a limited geographical area as the Near East, we find that not only have the names a common derivation, but many of the religious ideas variously expressed by the different cultures stem from the same basic ideas. The forms of worship, as far as we can reconstruct them from our limited literary and archaeological evidence, may appear quite unrelated, and the stories that circulated about the gods and heroes may reflect different social and ethnic backgrounds. But the underlying themes are turning out often to be the same. The worshippers of Dionysus headed their cultic processions with an erect penis, while those of Jesus symbolized their faith with a fish and a cross, but essentially all represent the common theme of fertility and the creative power of the god. Even within the Bible, language has hitherto posed a major barrier to research into Christian origins. Jesus and his immediate followers are portrayed as Jews, living in Palestine and adopting Jewish customs and religious conventions. The religion propounded by the New Testament is at root a form of Judaism, but the language in which it is expressed is Greek, a non-Semitic tongue, Words and names like Christ, Holy Ghost, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary come through Hebrew channels but have Greek forms or translations in the New Testament. The words of Jesus are quoted freely and often given the weight of incontrovertible authority. But in fact, nobody knows for certain what he said. Since what we have are translations of a supposedly Aramaic original, of which all trace has otherwise been lost. A large part of Christian scholarship has been devoted to trying to reconstruct the Semitic expressions underlying New Testament phraseology, with varying degrees of success but little absolute certainty. In the forms in which we know them, Greek and Hebrew are very different in vocabulary and grammatical structure. They belong to different language families. The one Indo-European, like Latin and English, and the other Semitic, like Aramaic and Arabic. Translation from one into the other can be at times extremely difficult, since they express not only distinctive linguistic attitudes but underlying philosophies. One impediment to mutual understanding between the Semitic and non Semitic world today is that mere mechanical translation of, say, Arabic words into English cannot express adequately the intention of the speaker, and dangerous misunderstandings can too often arise as a result. What we have now discovered is that by going far enough back in time, it is possible to find a linguistic bridge between these ethnic and cultural groups. However far apart their respective languages and philosophies may have become, they stem from a common, recoverable source, and it is there that any realistic study of Christian and Jewish origins must begin. The root of Christianity, in this sense, lies not in the Old Testament, but, like that of Judaism itself, in a pre-Semitic, pre-Hellenic culture that existed in Mesopotamia some 2 or 3 thousand years before the earliest Old Testament composition. The Christian doctrine of the fatherhood of God stems not from the paternal relationship of Yahweh to his chosen people, but from the naturalistic philosophy that saw the divine creator as a heavenly penis impregnating Mother Earth. The idea of divine love came not from the Israelite prophet's revelation of the forgiving nature of his God, but from a very much earlier understanding of the essential need for balance and reciprocation nature, moral as well as physical. Chapter 2: Sumer and the Beginnings of History. Civilization began in Sumer, in the land of the two rivers, Mesopotamia. No one knows where the Sumerians came from, but about 4000 BC they were already developing a culture which was to affect the whole world forever for over 5000 years. The rich agricultural land of the Abyssinian plains meant there was always sufficient food for man and beast. Fowl and fish were in abundance, and the Bible did well to find here its Garden of Eden. Amid such plenty, nomadic man needed no more to move from place to place as he exhausted the land's resources. His now was his was now an urban culture. He could build cities like ancient Eridu, accommodating several thousands of people. His simple buildings became classic examples of monumental architecture rising high above the surrounding plains. Arts and crafts became the specialist industries of the few. Then, the overbrimming wealth of Sumer could attract raw materials and services from less favored lands roundabout, and a class of traders arose to channel imports through their warehouses and to travel abroad seeking more. Labor was organized and rigorously controlled for efficient production, and in every city management of the economy, religion, and culture was in the hands of the king and the priesthood. For the land was the god's, without whose procreative power all life would cease. The king was his bailiff, a less temporarily earthbound god whose function was also to ensure the productivity of the community. The administrative center of each district was the god's house, the temple, with its priestly officials whose control over the people was absolute. The temple was the seat of justice, land administration, scientific learning, and theological speculation, as well as the theater of religious ritual. It was the community's university and primary school, to which small boys would drag their unwilling steps each day to set the pattern of grammar school curricula for more than 5 millennia. It was in such temple colleges that their tutors built, over the next 2,000 years, some of the richest and most extensive libraries of the ancient world. From the ruins of ancient Nippur on the lower Euphrates, 100 miles or so from modern Baghdad, have come several thousand literary texts. A large number were written in the most prolific period of Sumerian culture, from about 2000 to 1500 BC. They evince a wide range of intellectual exploration in the fields of theology, botany, zoology, mineralogy, geography, mathematics, and philology, the results of centuries of creative thought. Along with a continuing search for new knowledge went the systematic preservation of past results. The Library of Nippur contained texts going back to around 2300 BC, as well as dictionaries, legal works, and myths reaching down nearly to the end of the second millennium. Elsewhere, the library at Uruk held a range of literature stretching some 3,000 years, from the earliest times to a century or so before the Christian era, when Sumerian was still being used as a special esoteric language. For, although after 2360 BC, Sumer had to share her hegemony of the region with her northern Semitic neighbors of Akkad, and afterwards lost political control completely, and she had set seal upon the cultural life of the Near East and the world for all time. Yet, a century ago, no one had ever heard of the Sumerians. Archaeologists who were at all interested in Mesopotamia were looking for the remains of the Assyrians and Babylonians, referred to often in biblical and classical sources. About the middle of the 19th century, Sir Henry Rawlinson and other scholars were examining clay tablets found in the ruins of ancient Nineveh. They were inscribed with wedge-shaped cuneiform signs already familiar as the writing of Semitic-speaking Akkadians, Assyro-Babylonians. To this family of languages belong Hebrew and Aramaic, sister dialects used in the Old Testament, and Arabic, the language of Muhammad's Quran and the modern Arab world. The initial decipherment of Akkadian cuneiform had been made by Rawlinson in 1800, mainly on the basis of trilingual inscription from Behustan in Persia. However, some of the tablets now being studied had, besides the familiar Semitic dialect, another quite unknown tongue. Interspersed between the lines, the script was the same, so that phonetic values of each sign could be transcribed even though the string of resultant symbols made no immediate sense. There were also discovered amongst the tablets word lists in which Akkadian words were set alongside equivalents in the strange tongue. Some scholars refused to believe it was a real language at all. They spoke of a secret script used by the priests to overawe the laity to preserve their rituals and incantations from the uninitiated. The name by which it was known in the texts, the tongue of Sumer, was incomprehensible, and it was some years before the experts would take it seriously. However, when later monuments were discovered, written only in this language and dating from a time before Semitic Akkadian was being written in Mesopotamia, even the most skeptical had to admit that there must have existed in the area a pre-Semitic population from whom the Assyrians had borrowed the art of writing. The cuneiform method of writing was well suited to the area. The alluvial soil of the plains provided an abundance of a particularly fine clay, which could be moistened and shaped into a lozenge or pat in the palm of the hand. The earliest shape of tablets was roughly circular, smoothly rounded on top and flat underneath. It was the shape of the flat loaf of the East even today, or of the biblical cake of figs, or circular disk of a spinning whorl. It was in fact the shape of the top of a mushroom, and it was from the fungus that it received its name. Later, the primitive bun tablet was regularized into a rectangular slab some 2 or 3 inches long and 1.5 or 2 inches wide, and capable of being held in the scribe's hand. The soft clay was firm enough to take and preserve the impression made by the squared end of its stylus, but not so tacky as to stick to the scribe's hand as he worked. As the texts required to be recorded grew longer, the tablets were made larger so that they could no longer be held in the hand. This meant that when the bigger tablets were introduced, the attitude of the scribe's hand to the clay as it lay now on the table underwent a change, and with it the orientation of the symbols, which turned 90 degrees. The jotting pad kind of tablet, recording some passing transaction or the like, was simply hardened by being baked in the sun. But this method gave too impermanent as a result for more important legal or religious texts, and offered too much scope to the forger, who had simply to remoisten the clay, smear over the impression, and write in a new word. Important documents were baked hard in an oven, and the method is used even today by archaeologists finding sun-baked tablets, which could too easily suffer damage during handling. When the Semites took over the Sumerian technique of writing, it had already developed stylized forms far removed from the first crude pictorial signs we find on the earliest tablets. The oldest text we know is probably a tally list of some kind and dates from about 3500 BC. It comes from Kish near ancient Babylon, and the signs at this stage are clearly recognizable representations of objects, like a head, a leg, an erect penis ejaculating sperm, and a hand. The signs had been made by drawing a pointed instrument through the clay like a pen. However, it was found that this method tended to push the clay into ridges before the stylus so that the signs became blurred, and crossing over previous strokes obliterated them. So the scribes began simply pressing the end of the reed into the clay, forming a series of separate wedge-shaped marks. Inevitably, the flowing line of the original drawings was lost, stylized into formal representations, which became further and further removed from the subject. To take the above examples, we see the following sequence of development. The importance of such a primitive script for the etymologist is that he can illustrate the word with a picture. And as a child is taught to read with bricks on which word and picture are printed side by side, thus represents sag, head. The Sumerian words are conventionally transcribed into capital letters. Their Akkadian equivalents into lower case type, italicized, in this instance, reshu. Identification of the object with a human head here, of course, poses no problem. But there are instances where to have the accompanying picture is to gain a valuable insight into the Sumerian mind. For example, where one is trying to discover the significance of fire in fertility mythology, it is useful to know that to represent the idea of love, the Sumerian scribe drew a simple container with a burning torch inside to indicate the fermenting heat of gestation in the womb. Or again, as a sidelight upon social customs, the word for male slave was an erect, ejaculating penis superimposed with three triangular impressions used to express hill country or foreign land, and its feminine counterpart was the usual representation for woman, the pubic triangle with the slit F, the vulva, with a similar subscription. The word for male slave, Eri, leaves no doubt that his prime function was to procreate more slaves for his master, since a Home-born slave was a better security risk than one dragged away from his native land as a spoil of war. Unfortunately, this simple representative writing could not long survive the extension of the art to express more complex ideas than laundry lists. That same picture of the erect penis came also to be used not unnaturally to express standing up straight or length, and so a number of verbs and nouns could ultimately be intended by one picture. Furthermore, it could also represent the sound of the penis word, oosh, and so could be used simply as a phonetic symbol where no reference to the meaning of the original was intended. Our alphabet is also, of course, composed of symbols, which were originally pictures. The letter A, for instance, is derived from the picture of a bull's head, seen in its earliest form as B, stylized in Phoenician as and passing into early Greek as and A, and also so on to our Western alphabet. Similarly, our B began as a picture of a house, or rather the courtyard of a house. R, which appears in Phoenician as in Greek as and our D, was a door, hieroglyphic Li, from which it developed the characteristic triangular shape of Phoenician and Greek delta. J and L, our letter I, came from a very much simplified version of a hieroglyphic hand through Phoenician J into Greek 3 and so on. But the idea of having symbols represent single sounds, consonants, and vowels was a major step forward and was not to be achieved for more than 1,000 years after writing began in Sumer. Just how great an advance this constituted can be appreciated by realizing that the cuneiform system required some 300 different signs, and that each of these ideograms could represent a number of different sound values. For instance, the sign for a road junction, Silla or Sill, also meant tar, making a decision, judge or kud, cut, or clayash, break, grind up. All have this radical idea of division, but its extension to similar motifs, physical and juridical, brings under the same ideogram a variety of different words. Similarly, the ideogram for scrotum, simply a skin bag. Dubur can also represent dugan, wallet, kalam, kidney, and even garish, butterfly, presumably from its origins in a chrysalis. When Akkadian took over the cuneiform system, the Semitic scribes added to the lists of values attaching to each ideogram those relating to their own equivalents of the Sumerian words. For example, Sumerian sag, head, was translated by Akkadian reshu, so too the Sumerian values of the head ideogram. They added, for their own phonetic and etymological approximations, sack, sag, sack, shack, shag, shack, resh, res, rish, riz. Incidentally, it should be noted that Sumerian and Semitic had single consonants representing our sh sound, shown here as sh in Semitic and sh in Sumerian. Obviously, learning to read and write would be very much easier if the student had only to memorize a couple of dozen signs representing individual sounds, consonants, and vowels, and use these symbols to express the phonemes of which each sound group or word was composed. He could then build up any word he wanted, like a Meccano model of standard shaped pieces. Not surprisingly, until this radical step forward had been taken, proficiency in this highly complex cuneiform system was the privilege of a few, and carrying it with power and prestige tended to resist change and the wider dissemination of the craft. Even when it did arrive, alphabetic writing was used to express only the harder consonantal sounds, whilst in reading the softer vowels had to be inserted according to the most likely meaning of the word in the context. This is still the case in many parts of the Semitic world, where voweling words in Arabic newspaper printing, for example, is the exception rather than the rule. Indeed, full voweling systems for most Semitic scripts were not introduced until the Christian era, and in the Bible, considerable doubt can arise over the precise meaning of a passage because the text was only consonantally written and the context insufficiently clear to offer grounds for certain interpretation. The advantage of the old, clumsy syllabic writing to the modern decipherers is that it shows the vowels as well as the consonants of the dead language. When one is trying to relate words from different language groups of widely varying dates, every scrap of information about their early pronunciation is of the utmost value. Because we have the vowels of Sumerian, we can trace the development of its vocabulary into related dialects with more certainty than would have been possible had the alphabet been invented and widely used 1,000 years earlier. The Sumerian language is put together like a house of bricks. First, there are certain word bricks expressing basic idea, like kurur, conquer, ba, give. On to these, the writer adds other words, bricks, like ta or ni, modifying the verb in some way or adding a possessive suffix like my, his, or their to a noun. These added particles do not concern us so much in this study, since the words we are interested in are built mainly of the basic word bricks. What is of vital importance for our researches is, however, that unlike many other languages, including our own, Sumerian tends to keep these basic idea words unchanged. English often expresses tense in a verb by altering the sound within the root, as he gives, but for the past tense, he gave. I run, but I ran, and so on. Sumerian will keep the same radical elements, merely adding a particle word, brick to modify the verb or its relationship with other grammatical members of the sentence. Thus, in our search for a Sumerian idea word within Indo-European or Semitic names, we can feel confident that whatever phonetic changes it may have undergone through dialectic influences, the radical element we seek will originally have been a single, unchangeable word brick. And once we can penetrate to that, we stand a good chance of deciphering the original meaning of the name. And sometimes two or more radical elements can be combined to form a new word brick, like sila, road junction, abbreviated sometimes to sil. Clearly, this word is a combination of si, finger, and la, joined together. The overall picture being that of Winston Churchill's victory, V sign. We should express that supposed original form of two separate but as yet uncombined elements as si la, with a preposited asterisk. This sign, here and elsewhere, indicates a verbal group whose constituent parts are known to have existed in Sumerian, but whose grouping or combination in that precise form does not actually appear in literature so far recovered. At this point, it must be emphasized that although we now have thousands of tablets from which to reconstruct a great deal of the vocabulary of Sumerian, they represent only a fraction of the original literature. Doubtless, there is much more to be found beneath Mesopotamian soil, for archaeology has already demonstrated the very high level of Sumerian civilization and extent of its accumulated learning. It is now possible to propose combinations of known root elements with a fair degree of assurance. Nevertheless, the asterisk will appear frequently in the following pages and serve to remind us that such reconstructions, however probable, must find adequate cross-checking through the cognate languages if they are to be anything but speculative. Furthermore, They are only possible when the phonetic rules governing consonant and vowel changes from one language into another have been established. We know that Sumerian was spoken in more than one dialect. These are referred to in the texts, but there is not yet sufficient material to reconstruct them completely, or to know for certain their geographical and literary boundaries. What is now apparent, however, is that some of the most important phonetic changes evidenced by these dialects are observable in the forms of Sumerian words as they appear in Indo European and Semitic. Perhaps in the future it may be possible to draw dialectic boundaries with which will show not only where the Sumerians originated from, but what geographical points their language spread into Indo-European and Semitic worlds. For the moment, to know the phonetic changes that may be expected in vocal transmission of Sumerian roots makes it possible to trace them in other language families. For example, to our ears, M and G could hardly be more different. In Sumerian, however, they are dialectically equivalent. The word am, for instance, can appear as ag, mar, and gar, and so on. The same variation can be seen in the dialectical Greek, as in the word magnon, hunting net, which appears rarely as gagmon, and between Greek and Latin, as in amnos, lamb, Latin agnus. Again, to us, G is quite different from B, but they can fall together in Sumerian and also parallel one another in Indo-European dialects. For example, the Greek balanos, acorn, is the Latin and English glans. Some phonetic correspondences are more easily understood since the sounds are, in any case, not far apart, like B and P, with their soft sounds PH and F Latin, pater is our father. The sounds M and N are close enough to make their interchangeability easily comprehensible, as are the liquid letters R and, but not so immediately R and L, but not so immediately obvious is a common variant in the Sumerian and Semitic worlds between L and N. L and SH. And this has particularly to be looked for when Sumerian origins are sought for names in Semitic format. Specialists will note for themselves phonetic correspondences affecting their own fields of linguistic interest, but another variant which may seem strange at first sight to the non-specialist reader is that between the Sumerian KH, a somewhat throatish rasping sound akin to the CH in the Scottish loch, and hard G. This interchange occurs within Sumerian and also externally. For example, mach, M-A-K-H, great, appears in Greek as megas, Latin magnus. On the other hand, Sumerian KB is found as its straightforward phonetic equivalent in the Greek CHEI, transliterated in these pages as KH for the sake of uniformity. In, for example, the kalbane, a kind of gum, but as hard in the Latin cognate, galbanum. Vowels follow a fairly uniform and easily recognizable pattern. However, the sound I often disappears between consonants in the derived forms. For example, the Sumerian bil, bum, appears in the Greek flago and Latin flagro, burn, the source of our flame. But the medial I has disappeared between the B and in the full form of the Sumerian originally was probably bil, ag. The Greek, it will be noted, has depressed the A of the last elements to E, although Latin preserved the original sound. This flattening of the A sound is very common. Less expected is the frequent change of the Sumerian U, normally appearing in the cognates as U or O to the Greek. Among other vowel changes which might be mentioned here are those combined vowels we call diphthongs. Some are predictable enough when they occur through the conjunction of A and O. for example, becoming long O, or E and I becoming EI. But some diphthongs have arisen through the loss of an intervening consonant, particularly the letters 1, 2, 3, and illegible. An interesting example of this occurs in the title of Apollo, Paion, and the Greek plant name Paionoi, our peony. Both go back to our original Bariauna, which reappears with only the A and U combined in the New Testament Barianos, Bar Jonah, Peter's surname. Summarizing, in the language and culture of the world's most ancient civilization, Sumerian is now possible to find a bridge between the Indo-European and Semitic worlds. The first writing known is found on tablets from the Mesopotamian basin, dating some 5,000 years ago and consisting of crude pictures drawn with a stylus on soft clay. Later, the recognizable pictures became stylized into ideograms made up of nail or wedge shape impressions, so called cuneiform signs, each representing syllables of consonants and vowels. These syllables made up word bricks, which resisted phonetic change within the language and could have joined together to make connected phrases and sentences. To such word bricks, we can now trace Indo-European and Semitic verbal roots, and so begin to decipher for the first time the names of gods, heroes, plants, and animals appearing in cultic mythologies. We can also now start penetrating the root meanings of many religious and secular terms whose original significance has been obscure. The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Chapter 3. The Names of the Gods. We are sometimes misled by the proliferation of gods and goddesses in popular mythology into believing that man started off his religious thinking with a vast pantheon of some hundreds of different gods. That, however, much is systematic theologians may have attempted to arrange them into some comprehensible order. It required a dramatic revelation from on high to convince him that there was really only one supreme moral deity. This idea found great favor with the 19th century theologians, for whom the recently discovered laws of evolution seemed to offer a scientific explanation of divine revelation. The Old Testament, they suggested, showed how primitive animistic ideas, that is, the deification of inanimate objects like stones and trees, gradually gave way to a more spiritual concept of one God, as man evolved towards a higher intelligence, and thus made it possible for the deity to communicate to mankind through his servants, the prophets. This singularly ill-conceived piece of biblical criticism had the advantage that is its extension to the New Testament revelation by the Christian theologians showed that since Jesus stood later in time, his revelation was necessarily more advanced than that of the Jewish prophets, and, less explicitly, that the 19th century theologians were rather better informed than either. Unfortunately, for these evolutionary thinkers, the Old Testament will not bear the weight of their theory. Moses is portrayed as a monotheist. The church divided its Godhead into three. The Bible cannot be used to illustrate primitive religion. The philosophical and moral concepts displayed in its writings vary enormously, and there is no internal evidence for a steady evolution of ideas from a multiplicity of gods and moral barbarism to one, righteous and humane, Heavenly Father. The God who is annoyed because his servant Saul failed to carry out his bidding to wipe out every man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass, of the Amalekites, is still pictured 1,000 years later, leaving his son to die in agony on a cross. On the other hand, the literature that contains the discourse of selfless love in 1 Corinthians 13 has already long before recounted a story which taught that lust without affection has a bitter fruit. If we are to make any enlightened guess at primitive man's ideas about God and the universe, it would have to be on the reasonable assumption that they would be simple and directly related to the world of his experience. He may have given the god numerous epithets describing his various functions and manifestations, but there is no reason to doubt that the reality behind the names was envisaged as one all powerful deity, a life giver, supreme creator. The etymological examination of the chief god names that is now possible supports this view, pointing to a common theme of life-giving fecundity. Those, the principal gods of the Greeks and Hebrews, Zeus and Yahweh, Jehovah, and names derived from Sumerian meaning, choice of fecundity, spermatoza, seed of life. The phrase is composed of two syllables, I, A, dialectically, Y-A, Z-A, dialectically Z-A. Juice, literally strong water, and U, perhaps the most important phoneme in the whole of Near Eastern religion. It is found in the texts represented by a number of different cuneiform signs, but at the root of them all is the idea of fertility. Thus, one U means copulate or mount and create, and another rainstorm as source of the heavenly sperm, another vegetation as the offspring of God, whilst another U is the name of the storm god himself. So far from evincing another vegetation as the offspring, so far from evincing multiplicity of gods and conflicting theological notions, our earliest records lead us back to a single idea, even a single letter, U, behind Judaism and Christianity, and indeed all the Near Eastern fertility religions and their more sophisticated developments. There lies this single phoneme, U. Quite simply, the reasoning of the early theologians seems to have been as follows. Since rain makes the crops grow, it must contain within it the seed of life. In human beings, this is spermatoza that is ejected from the penis at orgasm. Therefore, it followed that rain is simply heavenly semen, the all-powerful creator, God. The most forceful spurting of this seed is accompanied by thunder and shrieking wind. This is the voice of God. Somewhere above the sky, a mighty penis reaches an orgasm that shakes the heavens. The lips of the penis tip, the glands, open, and the divine seed shoots forth and is borne by the wind to earth. As saliva can be seen mixed with breath during forceful human speech, so the speaking of the divine penis is accompanied by a powerful blast of wind, the holy creative spirit, bearing the spittle of semen. This spittle is the visible speech of God. It is his Son in New Testament terms. The Word which was with God and was in the beginning with God, through whom all things were made, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life. In the words of the psalmists, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. Or, when you send forth your breath, they are created, and the face of the earth is restored. This idea of the creative word of God came to have a profound philosophical and religious importance, and was, and still is, the subject of much metaphysical debate. But originally, It was not an abstract notion. You could see the Word of God, feel it as rain on your face, seeing it seeping into the furrows of Mother Earth, the labia of the womb of creation. Within burns an eternal fire, which every now and then demonstrates its presence dramatically, by bursting to the surface in a volcano, or by heating spring water to boiling point where the earth's crust is thinnest. It was this uterine heat which made generation possible, and which later theologians identified with the place and means of eternal punishment. Also, beneath the earth's surface lay a great ocean, whose waters, like those of the seas around and above the firmament, were the primeval reservoirs of the gods' spermatozoa, the Word. They were, therefore, seas of knowledge, as the Sumerians called them, and could be tapped by seekers of truth, whether they looked to the heavens or to the earth beneath. That is, by means of astrology or necromancy, divination from the dead. This notion, that mortals could discover the secrets of the past, present, and the future by somehow projecting themselves to the seventh heaven, or down into the underworld, gave rise to much mythology and some curious magical practices, since common observation showed that dead and decaying matter melted back into the earth. It was thought that the imperishable part of man, his soul or spirit, the creative breath that gave him life in the womb, must either float off into the ether or return through the terrestrial vagina into the generative furnace. In either case, he was more likely to have access to the fount of all wisdom than when his spirit was imprisoned in mortal flesh. Since it was given to few men to be able to visit heaven or hell and return to tell what they had seen and heard, there arose the ideas of messengers or angels, those workers of miracles, as their name in Greek and Hebrew means. These demigods, or heroes, had access to both worlds and play an important part in ancient mythology. They could come from above in various guises or be conjured up from the ground, like the ghost of Samuel, drawn to the surface by the witch of Endor for consolation by King Saul. One important aspect of this idea of heavenly and subterranean founts of knowledge is that since plants and trees had their roots beneath the soil and derived their nourishment from the water above and beneath the earth, it was thought possible that some varieties of vegetation could give their mortal consumers access to this wisdom. Herein lies the philosophical justification for believing that hallucinatory drugs distilled from such plants imparted divine secrets or prophecies. Such very special kinds of vegetation were, then, angels, and to know their names was to have power over them. A large part of magical folklore was devoted to maintaining this vital knowledge of the names of the angels. It was not sufficient simply to know what drug could be expected to have certain effects. It was important to be able to call upon its name at the very moment of plucking and eating it. Not only was its rape from the womb of Mother Earth thus safely accomplished, but its powers could be secured by the prophet for his revelations without incurring the heavy penalties so often suffered by those misusing the drug plants. Just as these growths were more powerfully endowed with God's semen than others, so men and animals differed in their possession of the vital force. Some were more fierce and lustful, and some were more wise. So-called men of God were particularly fortunate in this respect. They were in a very special sense his sons, and had a particularly close relationship with the deity. He could speak through them. They caught his word, as it were, and spat it out to his less God, attuned fellow men. Priest and prophet believed that the spittle-laden breath that came forth from his mouth when he spoke, as the God's messenger, was not his, but the God's. Such words, once released, had a power and motivation of their own. They could not only foretell events, they brought them about. No wonder the beleaguered citizens of Jerusalem put Jeremiah and his gloomy prognostications into a miry cistern. Well, might they say that in the face of the Babylonian armies he was weakening the hands of the soldiers who are left in this city. For the same reason, the king cut Jeremiah's doom-laden scroll into small pieces and dropped them into the brazier. For the word was as potent in writing as when uttered in speech. In the Sinai myth, Yahweh himself writes the 10 words or commandments, and the tablets thus inscribed have thereafter to be kept in a box and venerated within the shrine as a divine manifestation. God was the ultimate source of justice. By this was meant the ordering of society towards stability, maintaining a balance between opposing, otherwise disruptive forces. This might involve laying down certain regulations for conduct to which injured parties might appeal in the courts, but divinely given law was not simply a code of behavior. It was another expression of natural equilibrium, that ordering of affairs that began when primeval chaos gave way to creation. Law was thus a gift of God. In Semitic, the same words are used for justice and religious almsgiving, and specifically in the Old Testament for rain. Thus the prophet Joel bids his listeners rejoice in Yahweh, your God, for he has poured down for you a shower of rain. The Hebrew law, Torah, is literally the outpouring. The lawgiver, or teaching, is the outpourer, properly of semen, grace, favor. Kings and priests are pourers of bounty, lawgivers and teachers, in their capacity as the gods' earthly representatives. They were reckoned especially endowed with divine grace. The word for which in both Hebrew and Greek refers to the flowing of seed. They were shepherds of their people, the idea behind which, as we saw above, had to do with promoting fecundity, and that the king had within him the god semen. He was held to be a strong man, representing his god on the field of battle, and no less virile in the harem. When this important faculty deserted him, he could be deposed. Hence King David, whose name means lover or loved one, when his manly prowess seemed to be failing, sought stimulation at the hands of a young and beautiful virgin, Abishag, and she served the king, but he knew her not. The fertility aspect of divine and royal shepherding can be seen in another Sumerian word for shepherd, which appears right across the ancient world in names and epithets. It is Sippa, literally stretched horn or penis. We may now recognize it in the biblical phrase Yahweh Sabaoth, from Sippa, Ud, penis of the storm. The Sumerian storm god, Iskur, has a name with much the same meaning, mighty penis. So among the Semites he was known as Adad, mighty father, with the same general idea of the great fecundator of the skies. In the Old Testament, the name we know as Joseph means Yahweh's penis, really just a shortened form of Yahweh Sabaoth. Over in Asia Minor, this Old Testament divine title appears in classical times as an old cultic cry to the Phrygian deity Sabazos, Ey Saboi. The name of the god itself is composed of the same Sumerian Sippa, to which has been added the element zi, z, erect. This is just one example of how we can now span the whole area of our study and bring together apparently quite disparate religious cults simply through being able to decipher the names and epithets of the respective gods. Similar phallic designations are given, as we now see, to many Sumerian, Greek, and Semitic gods, tribal ancestors, and heroes. Hercules, that great club bearer, was named after the grossness of his sex organ, as he was the Hebrew tribal ancestor Issachar, perhaps the best known of the old Canaanite fertility gods. Baal derives his name from a Sumerian verb, al, which means bore, which, combined with a performative element, ba, gave words for drill and penis, and gave Latin and us our word phallus. In Semitic, Baal is not only the divine name, but has also the general meaning of Lord, husband. Hosea, the Old Testament prophet, makes a play on the general and cultic uses of the word when he has Yahweh to say to Israel. In that day you will call me my man, and you will no more call me my Baal. I shall banish the name of Baals from your mouth. More than any other heavenly body, it was the sun which commanded most respect as the embodiment of God. It was the creator, the fecundator of the earth. The ancients saw the glowing orb as the tip of the divine penis, rising to white heat as it approached its zenith, then turning to a deep red, characteristic of the fully distended glans penis as it plunged into the earthly vagina. And in the cultic centers this ritual was enacted emeritively by the entry of the priest into God's house. The temple was designed with a large measure of uniformity over the whole of the Near East, now recognizable as a microcosm of the womb. It was divided into three parts: the porch, one representing the lower end of the vagina up to the hymen, or veil, the hall, or vagina itself, and the inner sanctum, or holy of holies, the uterus. The priest, dressed as a penis, anointed with various saps and resins as representing the divine semen, enters through the doors of the porch, the labia of the womb, past the veil, or hymen, and so into the hall. On very special occasions, the priestly phallus penetrated into the uterus where the god himself dwelt and wrought his creative works. Even today, the Christian ritual and architecture probably owes much to the ancient tradition, as the priest heads the processional through the body of the womb, to reach its climax before the altar. The god was thought of as the husband of his land and people. This is a common figure in the Old Testament where Israel is featured as the wife of Yahweh, usually thus spoken of in passages accusing her of infidelity and seeking other lovers. The church is also described as the bride of Christ. In both cases, the God is the fructifying seed, the word or gospel, good news, whose fruitfulness depends upon the receptivity of the womb of his people's minds and hearts. The seed of God was supremely holy, whether it appeared directly from heaven as rain, or as the sap or resin of plants and trees, or as spermal emission from the organs of animals or men. It was sacred, and to waste it was a grievous sin. The processes and balance of nature demanded its effective use, since without it there could be no life or regeneration. The words for curse and sin have their roots in the idea of seed running to waste. This was the sin of Onan, who shirked his duty of giving his dead brother's wife more children by practicing coitus interpretus, or, as the Bible says, spoiling it on the ground. This was the sin. 2. Of Sodom, whose inhabitants preferred the attractions of two male visiting angels to Lot's daughters. That much used religious word sin then has basically the meaning of making ineffective, failing in one's object, the direct opposite of faith, which is at root to make effective or fruitful. This very ancient regard for the sanctity of semen, which lies at the core of fertility idea, is the ultimate cultic justification of the Roman Catholic strictures on birth control. The real objections to contraception have little to do with family morals, or indeed with morality at all as the modern world understands the term. It is simply that wasting seed is a religious sin. It is blasphemy against the Word of God, the Holy Spirit. In the same way, a barren woman was reckoned accursed. Jeremiah vented his wrath upon his fellow citizens, who spummed his gloomy prognostications by which their wives, childless and widowed. Most unhappy of women was she whose husband had divorced her for barrenness, or died leaving her childless. The Hebrew word for widow meant originally wasted womb, and similar derivations are to be found for the ancient words meaning unlucky, or the left side, being reckoned the unproductive side of the womb. In part, derived from this idea of the sanctity of sperm and the importance of fertility, is the crucial doctrine of the balance of nature. Upon this axiom rested the whole basis of moral and natural philosophy. God, as an act of grace, gives the seed of life. Earth receives it and engenders food for man and beast to eat it and reproduce themselves after their own kind. At death they return to earth, which in turn produces more vegetation to feed their offspring. So the cycle of nature continues season after season. But man must soon have realized that this highly desirable state of affairs could continue only so long as new life followed death. Kill too many animals one year, and there are insufficient to breed for the next. Reap too many harvests from the same field, and you reduce it to a desert. The terms of human relationships become too rich at the expense of your neighbors, and eventually they will turn on you like starving wolves. Revenge, blood with blood, and your personal feud will become tribal war. Herein lies the root of the doctrine of loving one's neighbor, of the soft answer that turneth away wrath. Socially, as agriculturally, all life depends upon keeping the balance between giving and taking and avoiding extremes. Nevertheless, the cycle of nature had first to be set in motion by the creative act of the God, and thereafter the initiative remained with him, as the New Testament's writer says. By grace you have been saved through faith, and this was not from yourselves, but as a gift from God. The Greek and Hebrew words for this kind of saving derive from a basic conception of fulfillment, restoration, healing, or life. The same element in Sumerian shush or shua appears in the name of Joshua, Jesus, attached as an epithet to Yahweh. This salvation in the Bible is the prerogative of the God, an act of merited love or grace. It followed, then, that man was continually in a state of indebtedness or sin, and ever at the mercy of his divine creditor. When the God, for some reason, decided to withhold his seminal bounty, all life perished, and there was nothing man could do about it. The awareness of his insufficiency that makes the psalmist cry plaintively, "What is man that thou rememberest him? has had an important and largely deleterious effect on man's self consciousness. On the one hand, it urged upon him humility, and served as a brake to his self aggrandizement over his fellows. The Roman general, in his triumphal chariot, had by him a slave continually to remind him, above the roars of popular acclaim, "Look back! Remember you are but a man." And on the other hand, a basic insecurity tended to restrict man's natural curiosity and willingness to experiment dangerously, and has served his political and ecclesiastical masters rather better than his own spiritual and economic advancement. Cultically, this state of indebtedness gave rise to the idea that man should make the gods some token rememberest a sacrifice, a kind of atonement which might, in some small degree, restore the balance between benefactor and beneficiary, since the first, born of men and beasts, and the first reaped fruits of harvest were considered to be more favorably endowed with the source of life than later progeny, and thus the more precious and strong they were chosen for restoration to the deity. The blood containing the breath of life, the Holy Spirit, taboo even now among Jews and Muslims, was first poured back into the earth's womb, and the flesh then consumed by the element that had created it, fire. Alternatively, part at least of the flesh was eaten by the gods' representatives, the priests. This idea of the atoning sacrifice had an important influence on later developments of the cult, particularly in Christianity and its immediate forerunners. Here, attention was centered upon one particular piece of vegetation, deemed more powerfully endued with the god than any other, and whose sacrifice and consumption by the initiate was thought to restore the lost sense of balance, to heal the rift, and to make possible the mystical unity with God. Summarizing, then, we should not look for a multiplicity of gods in the ancient world, but rather many aspects of the one deity of fertility, the creative force that gives earth and its creatures life. The god was the seed, his name and functions finding verbal expression in the one Sumerian phoneme, U. The whole fertility philosophy, on which the various cults of the ancient Near East centered, we may term simply a U culture. The god expressed his seed from heaven as a mighty penis ejaculating sperm at orgasm. It entered the womb of Mother Earth through the labia, the furrows of the land, and formed a great reservoir of potency in the heart of the world. Their gestation took place in the furnace of the terrestrial uterus. There, too, was thought to be the source of all knowledge. And since the creative semen of the god was also the word, acquisition of which by man gave him part of divine omniscience, it followed that those plants which were able to tap this power of knowledge to a greater degree than others, the sources of hallucinatory drugs, could impart to those who imbibed their juice knowledge of the gods. Chapter 4. Plants and Drugs. Vegetation was the fruit of God's union with earth. Like any other offspring, some of the children were strong and vigorous, others weaklings. Some trees had wood that was hard and suitable for building houses and ships. Others rotted quickly and proved treacherous. Some woods were springy and full of life, and gave the archer his bow. Others cracked easily, and served only for kindling. Some fruits were soft and sweet, but others bitter, and full of some strange power that could kill or cure. Man's first experiments in the use of plants as drugs must have been extremely hazardous. Doubtless, he watched first their effects on animals, as the shepherd's Melamumpus is said to have discovered the purging properties of the hellebore by noting its effect on his goats. Gradually experience, often painfully acquired, would have given the inhabitants of each locality a primitive pharmacopoeia for their use, and visitors from elsewhere would have introduced new plants and drugs. Over the course of time, a store of experiential knowledge would have accumulated and been made the subject of special study by a few of the elders, the wise men. Later, the physicians were to become a privileged class of people, wielding tremendous power among their fellows, and ensuring a continuance of their position by maintaining strict secrecy over their craft. Our first medical text is a Sumerian tablet from the end of the third millennium, listing remedies made from milk, snakeskin, tortoiseshell, salt, and saltpeter, and from plants and trees like cassia, myrtle, asphotidia, thyme, willow, pear, fir, fig, and date. Later, we find an abundance of medical tablets and botanical lists with their Sumerian and Akkadian names for these trees, for the trees and plants, their fruits, barks, saps, and resins, and their preparation and uses in medicine. This kind of careful cataloging of plant life does not appear in the Western world until the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and particularly with Theophrastus, 72 to 287 BC, a pupil of both Plato and Aristotle. His Inquiry into Plants lists some 400 species with their forms, habits, habitats, fruitification, and cultivation, and their uses. Clearly, he must have put the services of his 2,000 or so students to good use, since he quotes the results of first-hand inquiry in places which he could hardly have visited himself in one lifetime. He was also able to avail himself of the observations made into local botanical specimens by his contemporary Alexander the Great and his armies as they ranged widely over the Near and Far East. Thereafter, we have to wait until the first Christian century for a comparable systematic study of plants. Disquirides, a contemporary of Claudius and Nero, has left us, in his De Materia Medica, a concise attempt to systematize rather than merely list the drugs he records. He separates his remedies into their respective vegetable, animal, and mineral sources. His descriptions are terse and acute, and largely free from old wives' tales. Happily, from our point of view, about the same time, Pliny the Elder, AD 23 to 79, was writing a rather less scientific work, abounding in folk lore, as well as more sober gleanings from earlier botanists. His natural history is a mine of information, not so much for his descriptions of the plants and their identifications, many of which are quite unreliable anyway, as for the stories about them, which had come down in popular mythology and folklore. He describes the superstitions that attend the plant's extraction from the ground, its preparation and uses. He gives us stories about how their qualities were first observed by the ancients and why they were named as they were. Of course, factually, his tales are often quite irrelevant, but very often there are elements which relate to a probable decipherment of the name and thus a positive link with another plant or drug listed quite separately. In our quest for the sources of ideas and mythologies, this kind of information is more important than detailed descriptions of the plant's physiology. Old writings, thought to contain secrets of the healing arts, came to be highly prized. Josephus, in the first Christian century, says of the Jewish sect called the Essenes that they display an extraordinary interest in the writings of the ancients. singling out in particular those which make for the welfare of the soul and body. With the help of these, and with a view to the treatment of diseases, they investigate medicinal roots and the properties of stones. Such writings were often ascribed popularly to Solomon, credited in the Bible with knowledge of trees from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall, and later tradition ascribed to the king even greater powers, knowledge of the art used against demons for the benefit and healing of men, as Josephus says elsewhere. He adds that Solomon composed incantations by which illnesses are relieved, and left behind exorcisms with which those possessed of demons drive them out, never to return. Interestingly, the practice of this kind of Solomonic demonology was not dead in the first century. Josephus records actually seeing a cure effected by this very great power, by one Eleazar, a fellow countryman, and very possibly an Essene. He put to the nose of the possessed man a ring which had under its seal one of the roots prescribed by Solomon. Then, as the man smelled it, he drew out the demon through his nostrils, and when the man at once fell down, he adjured the demon never to come back into him, speaking Solomon's name and reciting the incantations which he had composed. Identifying the drug producing plants, then, was not the only factor in early pharmaceutical and medical practice. It was one thing to be able to recognize a drug plant, even to know its popular name. It was another to know how to extract and purify the active ingredient, and, above all, to know the right dosage. There were other complications. Some drugs were so powerful that they could only be safely administered on certain days or after lengthy preparation of the body and mind. It was also well known that overpowerful drugs had to be countered with another, having the opposite effect, as in the case of the purge, hellebore, and with some narcotics, which had to be offset with stimulants. To know the correct dosages in these cases required an appreciation of the susceptibility of the patient to the drug's effects, and perhaps the most difficult calculation of all, much depended on the recipient's fate allotted him at his birth, the factor that determined his individuality, his physical stature, the color of his eyes, and so on. Only the astrologer could tell this, so that the art of medicine was itself dependent for success on astrology and the considerable astronomical knowledge this presupposed. Just such an astrological chart has come down to us from the Essene Library, recovered recently from the Dead Sea Caves. It is written in code, composed mainly by reversing the normal order of the letters, that is, reading from left to right instead of right to left in the usual fashion of Semitic scripts, and substituting Greek and other alphabets for some of the square letter Hebrew writing found elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The document is unfortunately only fragmentary, and has been put together from scores of tiny pieces found scattered on the floor of a cave. Nevertheless, the purport is clear. It is a chart of the physical and spiritual characteristics to be expected of the people born in certain sections of the zodiac. Thus, someone born under the sign Taurus would possess, among other features, long and thin thighs and toes. The spiritual makeup of the subjects was reckoned as so many parts of light and so many of darkness, the total available for distribution being 9, presumably related to the months of gestation in the womb. The Taurus person would have a mere 3 parts fruits of light to 6 of darkness. More uncouth was the subject whose zodiacal assignment is missing from the text, but whose physical characteristics are marked with a certain coarseness, such as having thick fingers, hairy thighs, and short and stubby toes, and no less than 8 parts derived from the house or pit of darkness, and but one from the house of light. The best favored subject recorded in the extant text is a curly bearded gentle man of medium height, with eyes like black and glowing coals, well ordered teeth, and fine tapering fingers, and the opposite apportionment of light and darkness to the last mentioned bully. The Dead Sea Scrolls, like the New Testament, make much of the antagonism between light and darkness, and it is usually assumed that this everywhere is equivalent to good and evil. Thus, the so called children of light are those who do good, and the children of darkness are those who wantonly harm their fellow men. However, this distinction is not necessarily what we should call a moral one. The fruits of the Spirit of truth, with which light seems to be identified, begin with healing, peace and longevity, and fruitfulness. The ways of the spirit of falsehood are greed, wickedness, lies, haughtiness, and pride, deceit, cruelty, bad temper, and so on, and what we should call, in general, faults of intemperance and arrogance, an imbalance of character. We might label such defects as moral wrong, but in the eyes of the ancient philosophers they were inherited predispositions, occasioned largely by a man's fate allotted him at birth according to the stars. Medicine was as much a part of righting this imbalance of moral character as religion. The two were, in fact, inseparable. To administer the drugs correctly, one had to know just what the inherited traits of the patient's character, and for this inquiry, as our cryptic scroll from the Dead Sea shows, the physician looked to the stars. The combined arts of medicine and astrology were known and practiced by the Sumerians and their Mesopotamian successors, as we know from their cuneiform records, as well as the repute they enjoy in this respect in the ancient world. Stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth, cries Isaiah, to the virgin daughter of Babylon. Perhaps you may be able to succeed. Perhaps you may inspire terror. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let them stand forth and save you. Those who divide the heavens, who gaze at the stars, who at the new moons predict what shall befall you. Their cultural, if not ethnic, successors were the Magi, the wise men of gospel birth story. They were the great drug peddlers of the ancient world and are often cited by Pliny as sources of therapeutic folklore and of the less familiar names of plants and drugs. He treats them with contempt for the most part, but nevertheless quotes them at great length and says that the philosopher Pythagoras, first in his view to compose a book on the properties of plants, and his colleague Democritus, visited the Magi of Persia, Arabia, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and so amazed were the ancients at these books that they positively asserted quite unbelievable statements. Discordus quotes them as sources of special names of plants under the title prophets, prophetia. This is particularly interesting because the old Sumerian word for physician, a zu, or one zu, izu, literally water, oil expert, also stands for prophet, seer. The name Essene, known otherwise only in its Greek transliterated form, comes probably from the same root. Prognostication was always an important part of medicine. It is most excellent for a physician to cultivate special insight, pronia, knowing things about the patient without being told them, writes a contributor to the Hippocratic collection after 300 BC. Since he knows and foretells the past, present, and future, men would have confidence to entrust themselves to his care, and by an early forecast. In each case, he can tend aright those who have a chance to survive, and by foreseeing who will die, he will escape blame. However, there was much more to this pronia than merely knowing who was likely to be in a position to pay your bill at the end of the controlled health and sick pay your end at the treatment. The physician had to be able to communicate with the spirit world, to exercise influence over the gods and demons that controlled health and sickness, Bach, disease, and each part of the body had its own demon. To know its name was to tap some of its power and use it on behalf of the patient. So Jesus inquires of the unclean spirit his name, and thus able to banish him into the unfortunate pigs. The Greek word demon, derives through the Persian do. There is a strong linguistic affinity between M and W, from a probable Sumerian original, da, u, na, meaning having power over fertility. The demon thus had the power of affecting, for good or ill, birth and death and the various stages of health in between. The medicinal drug had similar powers, and the Hebrew word for be sick, dawa, and its cognate noun in Arabic, meaning medicine, come from the same root. So the demon of health and sickness and the drug are radically one and the same. If it was vital for the doctor prophet to know the names of the demons he was trying to counteract, it was just as important to be able to call upon their opposite numbers, the powers of healing contained in the drugs. These were the angels whose names formed an important part of the Essenine's secret knowledge, to preserve which the initiate was put under tremendous oaths. The basic principle is the same when Josephus' friend Eleazar called upon the name of Solomon as he administered the prescribed root, and Peter pronounces the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth over the lame man, an incantation tried with apparently less success by the 7 sons of Sceva. Since all life derives from the divine seed, it follows that the most powerful healing drug would be the pure, unadulterated semen of the god. Some plants were thought to have sap or resin approximating to this, their purity or sanctity in this regard being measured by their power as drugs to kill or cure or intoxicate. In Sumerian, the words for live and intoxicate are the same, tin, and the tree of life, just tin, Gesiitin, is the vine. Similarly, in the Greek amos and the Hebrew yayin, wine, there is probably a common Sumerian root, iau, ianu, semen, seed. The use of the name of Jesus, Greek Isis, as an invocation, Isus, as an invocation for healing was appropriate enough. Its Hebrew original, Yehoshia, Joshua, comes from Sumerian, Ja'a, Yushija, Shushu, semen, which saves, restores, heals. Hellenized Jews used for Joshua the Greek name Jason, very properly, since iason, healer, and the deponent verb iomai, heal, came from the same Sumerian source. In the New Testament, taunt, physician, heal thyself. We probably have a direct allusion to this meaning, as we certainly have in Jesus' title, Savior, Greek, soter, the first element of which reflects the same Sumerian word, shu, save, and so is rightly used in Greek for saving from disease, harm, peril, etc., and is a common epithet of Zeus and kings. The fertility god Dionysus, Greek Dionysus, whose cult emblem was the erect phallus, was also a god of healing, and his name, when broken down to its original parts, Iau, Shu, Shush, is almost identical with that of Jesus, having in you, new, seed, only in addition, semen, seed that saves, and is comparable with the Greek nosios, healer, an epithet of Zeus. The fertility deity, then, appeared in all living beings, but in some more than others, in those plants especially endowed with power to heal or kill. The drug plants became the subject of study among the witch doctors, prophets, and priests of the ancient world, and their experiential knowledge was passed on within their professional communities and zealously guarded, as well as the names and identities of the plants. They preserved those of the disease demons and the protective angels whose power was needed to secure and use the precious drugs. Furthermore, an essential part of healing, or giving life, was to know the patient's physiological and psychological makeup, and the degrees of the spirits of light and darkness that he had been granted by fate at his birth. These traits of character and bodily constitution could be determined by astrological means, so that the early doctors were also astrologers. He was also a prophet, a prognosticator. The arts of healing and religion were inseparable. End of chapter 4.